Class is now in session. I'm Professor Rocky, and today we'll be discussing Game 18 of the regular season between the Sharks and the St. Louis Blues, in which the Sharks have lost 7-6. So while the Sharks actually managed to set their new record for most goals this season by scoring 6 of them, in very, very typical Sharks fashion, they end up losing anyway because they also set the record for the most goals let in this season for the Sharks by giving up 7 to the Blues. Now, this one started off quite well for the Sharks as just a few seconds into this game, even faster than they scored against the Minnesota Wild in their previous game a few days ago, they get a goal from Timo Meier to make it 1-0. But that's where the sort of dam breaks, and we get this deluge of goals here between these two teams. And, if I sat here naming every single one of these players who scored, I'd probably be here for about a half hour, so let me just go by how the score went. So it started off 1-0 for the Sharks. The Blues would tie it up at 1 before the Sharks would make it 2-1, and that would be the final score at the end of the first period. Come second period, as the Sharks had done multiple times in the past, they end up giving up 3 goals to the Blues. It's made it 2-2 between the two teams. The Sharks would make it 3-2, the Blues would make it 3-3. The Sharks would then make it 4-3, and we would have a goalie switch in this one. Jordan Binnington ends up getting pulled for Ville Husso, who steps in, and kind of an interesting situation going on with Binnington. I always thought it was kind of a weird narrative surrounding Binnington, as if he was some sort of very aloof goaltender. This was kind of the narrative that surrounded him during that 2019 season where the Blues ended up winning the Stanley Cup, which, as I said, was kind of surprising because during the series between the Sharks and the St. Louis Blues, Binnington was very much not aloof and actually seemed like an extremely hot-headed goaltender, sort of akin to, I guess, Jonathan Quick of the Los Angeles Kings, and we see a lot of that come out here tonight, where he acts basically like a 3-year-old toddler and throws a temper tantrum as he gets pulled out of the net, goes to the Sharks bench, punches Shemek, then heads to center ice, ends up doing, or at least attempting to punch Erik Karlsson, kind of fakes him out, then heads down to the defensive zone for the Sharks and has a confrontation with Devan Dubnyk before finally heading off the ice and getting an unsportsmanlike conduct penalty. But in the end, the Blues would get the next goal anyway. It would be 4-4, and the game would be tied at the end of 2. Now, in the previous game between these two teams, the Sharks had a game tied at 4 going to the third, and the Sharks would end up scoring the only goal in that third period to win it 5-4. That would not be the case here tonight. Instead, the Blues would get their first lead of the game by making it 5-4. The Sharks would tie it up 5-5 before the Blues would make it 6-5. The Sharks would then tie it up 6-6 before finally the Blues would make it 7-6, and the Sharks would not have another goal left in them, and that would do it for the game. A 7-6 loss, not something that you see every day. Usually when your team is scoring 6 goals on the night, you should expect the 2 points, and the fact that the Sharks couldn't even end up getting 1 here tonight is very disappointing. And the main culprit for that, the main reason for that, is the first thing we're going to talk about today, which is, of course, the goaltender Devan Dubnyk ends up starting here tonight, which I don't necessarily have a problem with. But what I will mention before I get into these goals is, how does Devan Dubnyk end up letting in 7 goals in this game? Not necessarily a comment about how a goaltender lets in 7 goals in a specific game, but how is Dubnyk allowed to be even between the pipes for all 7 goals here tonight? We've seen multiple times Martin Jones get pulled this season after letting in 3 or 4 goals. It's happened probably about 3 or 4 times as well in a very brief season, and that's just a story for another day. And yet Devan Dubnyk here tonight lets in 4, then 5, then 6, then 7, and yet somehow stays in nets, which I was extremely surprised about. Now, this is not necessarily out of the ordinary situation. There have been many times where goaltenders have been let in and ended up letting in something like 6 or 7 goals, but this is usually in a case where, let's say, you're playing your backup and you have a game tomorrow where you want to start your starter, or you played just yesterday and your starter played, so you want to give him the rest, or maybe, especially in a season like this, you have a very compressed schedule, your starter has played so many other games thus far, and so you want to give him the night off and you let your backup get shelled a bit. But this is not the case in any of these situations for the San Jose Sharks. They don't play tomorrow, they did not play yesterday, in fact they haven't played for the last 5 days since Monday against the Minnesota Wild, and so I see no real reason why Dubnyk actually stays in. I'm not saying that Martin Jones would have necessarily been a massive difference maker if he had managed to come in between the pipes for the start of the third period, for instance. We can never really know what would have happened in this game if that happened, but leaving Devan Dubnyk in here at this point with how he played was a very, very weird decision in my opinion. Now, talking about the goals that he did let in, it was pretty much a disaster. There were a couple that he certainly had no real chance on. This second goal here, I guess, by the Blues from Blais. The first goal of the third period from the Blues, which was from McEachern shorthanded. But there were also multiple goals here that Devan Dubnyk absolutely should have had. The first goal of the game from Scandella. The fourth goal of the game for the Blues from Zach Sanford. You could say he definitely could have had the save on Brayden Schenn. He definitely could have had the ended up game winner on Scandella's second, and just kind of a very, very rough game for Devan Dubnyk. I would actually be quite mad to see Devan Dubnyk in nets on Monday, so we will likely see Martin Jones, and hopefully he doesn't let in a couple of goals, or else maybe we'll end up with Devan Dubnyk back between the pipes anyway. And just as a comment, one last thing on Devan Dubnyk. I've seen a lot of people be really high on Devan Dubnyk for whatever reason, and some people have even suggested, the Sharks should just ride with Dubnyk and give him a few straight games because he's been so much better than Martin Jones. That really hasn't been the case, just because Devan Dubnyk has come in relief of Martin Jones in games where the Sharks are trailing like 4 or 5 goals, and so the other team kind of lets their foot off the gas and allows Devan Dubnyk to make a few saves, like let's say we saw against the Minnesota Wild on Monday. That does not mean that Devan Dubnyk has been far and away better than Martin Jones. In fact, I've said, yes, Jones has a larger sample size, so this is definitely more likely to happen, but Jones has at least had a few games where he's been very good for the Sharks and stolen some away, along with the very bad games. Devan Dubnyk has had maybe 1 or 2 very solid games, but mostly it's been kind of shaky, all things considered, in my opinion, at the very least. But finally, moving away from the goaltender, I'll talk about Rudolf Balcers, because while it was a rough game for the goaltending, as he lets in 7 goals, it was a pretty successful game, at least on the offensive side of things for the Sharks, as they managed 6. And Balcers was a player who has been stepping into a bigger role for the San Jose Sharks in these past few games, got moved up to the second line, and ended up stepping into an even bigger role here tonight, just due to Tomas Hertl having to stay out due to having COVID. And not only is he keeping his spot on the second line, but he actually gets a spot on the Sharks' first power play unit, which actually ended up scoring a couple of goals here tonight, which was interesting to see, though the Sharks were given a ton of power plays, maybe as karma for what happened in the previous matchup between these two teams, where the Sharks got none. And Balcers was very up and down, you could say, this game. He was quite successful offensively, a couple of very nice plays on the offensive side, showed off some creativity, shows off some nice stick handling, but on the defensive side of the puck, Balcers also had a couple of big misplays. There was this giveaway that would lead to the first goal of the game for the Blues from Scandella. Obviously, even though it's one Dubnyk should have had, it's also a pass that was very, very ill-advised by Rudolf Balcers in this situation, and just kind of rough around the edges in that area. But in the end, Balcers ended up getting 19 minutes here tonight, and while I don't necessarily understand the full justification for allowing Balcers to jump into such a massive role, maybe, again, I've said this many times about Balcers, but maybe Booner knows something that I don't, and he's actually like a god when it comes to practice. But Balcers ends up as a pretty consistent, I guess, top 6 forward in the lineup for the Sharks, and we'll see how that works out game in, game out. Next, I'll talk about Ryan Donato, a player who I had called out at the end of the Minnesota Wild game. I had said that he had started the season so well, but in the past few games, he'd basically been doing nothing of what he was doing in the early parts of the season where he was actually succeeding. And I'm sure Ryan Donato absolutely watched my video about that and took that to heart and ended up playing a very good game here tonight. But he looked a lot better. He was definitely beginning to get back to what he was doing early on in the season, where he found a lot of success. He was using, the reason why so many fans, including myself, really grew to love Ryan Donato quite quickly at the start of the year wasn't necessarily because he was insanely skilled or insanely speedy or anything like that, but because he was an extremely hard-working player, and that's exactly what we ended up seeing out of Donato here tonight. There was one particular shift where he ended up trying to go for something like 3 different wraparound plays, just very strong on the puck, very just trying to make things happen. So it was a very good game from Ryan Donato, and hopefully that can be something we'll see from him more consistently like we did early on in the year. And finally, I'll talk about both Karlsson and Simek. So, of course, the Sharks were supposed to have a game on Thursday, but that one ended up getting postponed because Tomas Hertl ended up going down with the coronavirus. And so Karlsson and Simek were both given a couple of extra days of rest to try and return from their injury. Simek, it looked like he was going to play on Thursday. Karlsson's timeline was a bit more murky. It seemed as though he wasn't going to play on Thursday, and he would be more of a long shot here tonight for Saturday's game, but in the end, both players find themselves in the lineup, and both players had decent games, though certainly some rocky moments, as you would expect from all defensemen, really, in a game where the team gave up 7 goals. Obviously, they kind of had this big miscommunication moment, which ended up leading to the final goal of this game, which was the 7th goal game winner from Marco Scandella. But otherwise, I thought, Simek was decent in the defensive zone, but Karlsson in particular, I thought looked very, very strong in the offensive zone. He was making a lot of very nice offensive plays. One of his strongest games this season thus far offensively, and considering how Karlsson has looked at times defensively this season, you could even say it's one of his better games defensively, even if it wasn't necessarily that fantastic. So it's good to see that Karlsson came back from this injury, and even though it seemed like, at least timeline-wise, that it was a bit early, that doesn't seem to have that much of an effect on his game here tonight. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday, and it does not get any easier for this team as they'll take on the Colorado Avalanche in that one, who they have not beaten yet this season in their first 2 games. Class dismissed.